Welcome to True Crime Talks, where we dive into the chilling and heartbreaking stories behind real-life crimes. In today's case, a pastor's shocking descent into darkness leaves a community shattered and searching for answers. Pastor Elijah Wright was a respected figure in his small, devout southern town. Known for his passionate sermons and unwavering commitment to his congregation, he was seen as a pillar of the community. His sermons echoed with themes of love, family, and the strength of faith in trying times, often leaving congregants moved to tears. His church, a modest but well-loved sanctuary with a white steeple that pierced the sky, was filled each Sunday with families who looked to him for spiritual guidance. Elijah's reputation as a man of integrity, kindness, and conviction was well earned. He spent his days visiting the sick, counseling troubled couples, and organizing community outreach programs for those in need. His life appeared to be the perfect reflection of God's teachings. Deborah, Elijah's wife, was equally admired, though in a quieter way. She was a graceful woman, always impeccably dressed in modest attire, with a calm demeanor that complemented Elijah's fiery passion. Deborah was devoted to her family, raising their 5 children with care and instilling in them the same Christian values that defined their home. Caleb, the eldest, was preparing for high school, while his younger siblings, bright and energetic, brought joy and laughter to the Wright household. Together, they were the embodiment of a loving, faithful family that seemed destined for happiness and prosperity. The Wrights' home was warm and inviting, with walls adorned with family photographs and shelves lined with Bibles and religious texts. Friends who visited often commented on how harmonious the family appeared, how perfectly they seemed to reflect the ideals Elijah preached from the pulpit. The bond between Elijah and Deborah, while not openly affectionate in public, was perceived as solid and unbreakable. They had built a life together grounded in trust, shared purpose, and an unshakable faith in God's plan. But cracks had begun to form beneath the surface. Unspoken tensions lingered between Elijah and Deborah, though neither allowed these private struggles to show in public. Deborah's eyes often carried a sadness that few noticed, and her silences seemed deeper than they should have been. Those closest to her, a small circle of trusted friends, occasionally wondered about the burdens she carried, but she never spoke openly of any troubles. Elijah, focused on his ministry, was perhaps too preoccupied to see the full extent of his wife's inner turmoil. Everything changed one ordinary autumn afternoon when Caleb came home from school with a simple assignment. His biology teacher had encouraged students to explore genetics by conducting a basic DNA project involving their family members. Caleb was eager to learn more about his heritage and proposed the idea to his parents. Elijah, ever the doting father, agreed without hesitation, believing it would be a fun and educational experience for the children. Little did he know that this seemingly innocent school project would unleash a nightmare that would shatter his world. A local pharmacy provided an at-home testing kit which Caleb and his siblings used to collect samples. They laughed as they swabbed their cheeks, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath their innocent curiosity. When the results arrived weeks later, Elijah glanced at them with mild interest. His curiosity turned to confusion when he noticed a discrepancy. While Deborah's DNA matched perfectly with all 5 children, his own genetic markers showed no biological connection. Elijah's heart raced. Assuming a clerical error, he dismissed the results and ordered a private lab test to be sure. But the truth, once revealed, would become a harrowing descent into betrayal, unimaginable pain, and a secret so dark that it would destroy everything he had ever believed in. When the results arrived, Elijah noticed something strange. While he and Deborah were listed as the parents, there was no genetic match between him and any of his 5 children. Confused, he rechecked the results, but the anomaly remained. Suspicion crept in, and Elijah secretly tested Deborah and the children again at a private lab. The confirmation hit like a thunderbolt. The DNA revealed that Elijah's father, James Wright, was the biological father of all 5 children. The man he had looked up to his entire life, the man he trusted implicitly, had betrayed him in the most horrifying way. Elijah was consumed with rage, humiliation, and disbelief. How could Deborah have kept such a devastating secret? How had his father committed such a monstrous act? Questions swirled in his mind, turning his faith and family into a storm of anger and despair. The moment Elijah read the results from the second lab, he felt the ground shift beneath him. His chest tightened and his pulse thundered in his ears as he read the words again, unable to process what they revealed. The confirmation was cold, clinical, and undeniable. Every fiber of his being wanted it to be a mistake, a cruel joke. But science does not lie. The betrayal sank into him like a blade. He clenched the papers in his hand until they crumpled. The weight of the truth pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. In an instant, the foundation of his life, his marriage, his children, his faith in the sanctity of family, collapsed into ruins. He paced the floor of his study, his thoughts a chaotic storm of confusion, rage, and grief. Memories of his father flooded his mind. James sitting proudly in the front pew of the church, James guiding him through the early days of his ministry, James holding each of his children with the pride of a doting grandfather. Every memory now felt tainted with the venom of deception. Elijah's mind raced through years of moments with Deborah. He had believed her to be a loyal, loving wife. How had she managed to hide something so dark, so devastating? What had she endured in silence? He pictured her, always calm and composed, but now her silences seemed to scream with unspoken truths. Despite his anger, a painful knot of pity twisted in his gut. Was she a victim too? Had James manipulated her, coerced her into this twisted arrangement? The questions burned within him, their answers elusive and agonizing. His love for Deborah, once a strong and steady force, now twisted into a corrosive mix of love, anger, and heartbreak. He sat down heavily, head in his hands. His congregation, his children, his faith in the teachings he had spent years proclaiming, all of it seemed meaningless in the face of this revelation. How could he continue to stand before his flock and speak of truth, honor, and righteousness when his own life was a lie? Still, his mind would not rest. Why hadn't he seen the signs? His father, always so attentive, always present in ways that felt generous but now seemed predatory. James had never been anything but supportive, but now every act of kindness felt sinister, a calculated move in a vile game of control and secrecy. Elijah stared into the darkness of his study as the weight of his sorrow and fury grew unbearable. He knew the storm had only begun. Elijah confronted Deborah in private. Though the details of the confrontation remain unclear, sources close to the family say Deborah admitted everything. She revealed that James had coerced her into a relationship shortly after her marriage to Elijah. Fear and shame had kept her silent for years. Elijah's anguish deepened as the betrayal grew more complex. He struggled to reconcile his love for his children with the horrifying truth of their origin. His father, James, continued to deny the allegations, brushing them off as fabrications. But unable to share his anguish publicly, Elijah sank into isolation. His sermons grew darker, heavy with themes of sin, betrayal, and judgment. Congregants whispered about his sudden change, but no one dared ask questions. When Elijah finally confronted Deborah, the meeting was charged with emotions too intense to contain. It was not a simple discussion, it was a tempest of rage, heartbreak, and unanswered questions. Deborah, cornered by the undeniable truth of the DNA tests, broke down. Her composure, so carefully maintained for years, crumbled under the weight of what she had kept hidden. She confessed that James had manipulated her into a relationship soon after their wedding. It had begun with small intrusions, comments that blurred the line between familial affection and something far more sinister, and had escalated into something she had no power to stop. She described the years of silence, the nights of dread, and the overwhelming guilt that consumed her. Every glance at Elijah, every embrace of her children, had been a reminder of the nightmare she lived. Deborah's shame had rooted her to secrecy, believing that revealing the truth would destroy the family she desperately tried to protect. But now the truth had surfaced in a way that could no longer be hidden, and her confession, while truthful, brought no relief. Elijah's pain cut deeper with every word she spoke. He listened in silence, his heart splintering under the weight of her revelations. He was furious at Deborah for her silence, at his father for his monstrous betrayal, and at himself for never suspecting the darkness that had festered within his own family. But beneath the fury was a sorrow that threatened to drown him. Deborah's suffering, her years of entrapment and fear, painted a picture not of deceit but of survival. James Wright, the man Elijah had idolized, maintained his facade of innocence. He dismissed Deborah's confessions as delusions, her words as attempts to cover her own sins. In the face of undeniable evidence, he called her a liar, insisting that her accusations were the imaginings of a guilty mind. He carried on with his life as though nothing had changed, smiling and preaching righteousness, while the family he had poisoned crumbled under the weight of his actions. Elijah's fury grew into an unrelenting storm. He no longer saw his father as a man but as a predator who had stolen something sacred from him. Every memory of James, from childhood lessons to paternal pride, was now a grotesque reminder of deception and horror. Elijah's world, built on faith and family, had been hollowed out by the very people he had trusted most. As the torment swelled within him, Elijah withdrew from the world. His once inspiring sermons became dark and foreboding, filled with warnings of sin's corrosive power. The light that had once guided his ministry dimmed as his soul writhed in turmoil. Members of his congregation noticed the change, whispering about his growing severity and brooding tone. But fear of his intensity kept them silent, as in his isolation Elijah wrestled with the truth of his children. They were innocent, blameless products of a horror beyond their understanding. He loved them fiercely, but the knowledge of their origins gnawed at his heart. Every embrace, every look into their trusting eyes was a reminder of his father's violation and Deborah's hidden torment. He felt trapped in a life where every joy had been twisted into a reminder of pain. The rage, sorrow, and betrayal festered, a darkness from which he saw no escape. His once unshakable faith cracked under the weight of bitter truths, and the foundation of his existence teetered on the brink of collapse. The weight of the discovery proved too much. One night Elijah snapped. Consumed by the feeling that his life was built on a web of deceit, he confronted Deborah once more. This time his anger spiraled out of control. In a horrifying act of rage, Elijah killed her in their home. Panicked and distraught, Elijah dismembered Deborah's body, attempting to cover up the crime. He placed her remains in various locations around the town, hoping the fragmented evidence would obscure the truth. However, it didn't take long for Deborah's disappearance to raise alarms. Friends and family reported her missing, and an investigation was launched. Suspicion quickly fell on Elijah when his erratic behavior intensified. Investigators uncovered bloodstains in the Wright household, leading to Elijah's arrest. Elijah had spent weeks teetering on the edge of sanity, his mind consumed by the relentless storm of betrayal and torment. The truth of his father's violation and his wife's years of silence had broken him in ways he could no longer contain. On a cold, silent night when the walls of their home seemed to close in on him, he confronted Deborah once more. His grief twisted into fury, and his fury into a blinding, uncontrollable rage. He could no longer separate the woman he had once loved from the nightmare she represented. Every word, every tear, every expression on her face fueled the fury that had been simmering within him. Years of trust, love, and faith shattered as his mind plunged into darkness. He lashed out violently, his hands becoming weapons driven by his anguish. As the weight of what he had done descended upon him, a wave of panic overwhelmed him. The gravity of his actions hit with crushing force. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He stood over Deborah's lifeless body, the reality of her stillness searing into his mind. Desperation clawed at him as he wrestled with the enormity of his crime. Thoughts raced wildly, irrational and frantic. He could not undo her death, but he could try to hide what had happened. Elijah, his hands trembling and his breath ragged, set about dismembering Deborah's body. He worked methodically, though each movement was driven by fear rather than calculation. He convinced himself that scattering her remains would confuse authorities, that no single piece of evidence would lead back to him. In the stillness of the night, he moved through the streets of the town he had once loved, leaving fragments of her behind like the broken pieces of his own soul. Days passed, and Deborah's absence did not go unnoticed. Her friends, worried by her sudden disappearance, raised questions. Her failure to respond to calls or appear in public set off a chain of concern that led to a missing persons report. Investigators arrived at the right home, their inquiries polite but persistent. Elijah, hollowed out by guilt and sleepless nights, attempted to maintain a facade of innocence. He claimed to know nothing of her whereabouts, weaving lies around the truth that suffocated him. But the evidence within the home betrayed him. Despite his efforts to clean and conceal, traces of blood lingered beneath the surface. Detectives, skilled at reading the signs of hidden violence, grew suspicious. A deeper search revealed the stains that Elijah had overlooked, small remnants of a crime too brutal to erase completely. The truth, like the blood that had seeped into the floorboards, could not be contained forever. When the authorities placed Elijah in handcuffs, his hollow eyes stared into the distance. The man who had once spoken of faith and redemption had now become the subject of horror and tragedy, his own life forever marked by the darkness he could no longer escape. The trial that followed became a media sensation, drawing widespread attention as the horrifying details of the case came to light. The story of a respected pastor turned murderer, driven by a dark family secret, captivated and repulsed the nation. Elijah's composed demeanor in the courtroom stood in stark contrast to the grotesque nature of his crime. Prosecutors painted him as a man consumed by fury and willing to commit unspeakable acts to hide his shame and rage. The courtroom buzzed with tension as witness testimonies laid bare the truth. Family members and former friends recounted their interactions with Elijah and Deborah, weaving a narrative of hidden turmoil beneath a facade of perfection. Investigators detailed the evidence found in the right home, traces of blood, signs of a hasty cleanup, and the chilling discovery of Deborah's scattered remains. Each revelation added to the grim portrait of a man who had once been a beacon of righteousness, but had fallen into the depths of darkness. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the DNA evidence and Elijah's behavior in the days following Deborah's disappearance. The bloodstains matched Deborah's genetic profile, and the inconsistencies in Elijah's initial statements further implicated him. Prosecutors argued that his calculated dismemberment of her body showed premeditation, a desperate attempt to erase his crime and mislead the authorities. They emphasized the heinousness of the act, describing it as driven not only by personal betrayal but by an uncontrollable descent into madness. Elijah's defense sought to present a different perspective. His attorneys painted him as a man tormented by a horrifying revelation, a victim of manipulation and unimaginable betrayal. They argued that discovering his father's role in the conception of his children had fractured his mind, and that his actions were those of a man broken beyond repair. They introduced expert testimony on the psychological impact of trauma, suggesting that Elijah's mental state had diminished his ability to act rationally in the moments leading up to Deborah's death. The defense team also tried to redirect blame toward James Wright, calling attention to his predatory behavior and the long-term consequences of his actions. They claimed that James's betrayal had set in motion a chain of events that led to tragedy, implying that Elijah was as much a casualty as anyone else. However, their argument did little to diminish the horror of what had transpired. The act of dismemberment, in particular, was a point of no return in the eyes of many. As the trial neared its conclusion, the emotional weight of the case took its toll on everyone involved. Members of the congregation, once fervent supporters of Elijah, were torn between sympathy and revulsion. They had looked up to him as a shepherd of their faith, a man who had guided them with words of love and salvation. Now they wrestled with the dissonance between the man they knew and the monster the evidence revealed. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom was silent. Elijah sat motionless as the words rang out, "Guilty of murder." The sentencing phase brought further anguish as the court deliberated his punishment. The judge, acknowledging the complexities of the case but bound by the severity of the crime, sentenced Elijah to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Elijah was led away, the weight of his choices settled fully upon him. His legacy, once defined by faith and leadership, had become a cautionary tale of secrets, sin, and the destructive power of hidden truths. The church he had built, the family he had cherished, and the community that had revered him were left to pick up the pieces of a tragedy that would haunt them for generations to come.